2 hours ago, the Bank of Canada executed a financial maneuver that no allied government has ever attempted against the United States. Not a tariff, not a diplomatic protest, not a legal filing. A direct surgical strike at the one thing that makes the American financial system function as the center of global commerce. Canada froze $180 billion in U.S. Treasury holdings. Not sold, not threatened. Frozen. The Bank of Canada, acting on emergency authorization signed by Prime Minister Mark Carney at 6:47 this morning, placed the entirety of Canada's U.S. Treasury portfolio under a sovereign asset preservation order that prevents any transaction, transfer, or rollover until the order is lifted. The holdings, $180 billion in U.S. government debt, are still technically American obligations. They just became obligations that their largest allied creditor has formally declined to manage on Washington's terms. The bond markets opened this morning and saw something they had no framework to price. A G7 ally, the United States' largest trading partner, had formally interrupted its participation in the mechanism that funds the American government. Wall Street has 6 hours before the secondary Treasury market closes. What happens in those 6 hours will determine whether this is a warning shot or the opening move in a crisis that restructures the relationship between the U.S. dollar and the concept of allied trust. The White House has not yet responded publicly. The Federal Reserve Chair's calendar was cleared 40 minutes ago. This is not a drill. To understand why this move lands differently than anything Canada has done before, you have to understand what U.S. Treasury holdings actually are, and why the word frozen carries a specific and devastating meaning in sovereign debt management. When a country holds U.S. Treasuries, it is participating in an ongoing, active financial relationship. Treasuries mature. They roll over. New issuances replace old ones. Canada's $180 billion position includes $47 billion in treasuries maturing within the next 90 days. Under normal circumstances, those maturities roll automatically. The U.S. government counts on that rollover the way a homeowner counts on refinancing a mortgage. Canada has just told the mortgage company it is pausing payments, not defaulting, simply declining to participate in the rollover mechanism that American government financing depends on. The directive has 3 operational components, each calibrated to apply maximum pressure at the exact point where the dollar system is most vulnerable to allied action. First, the $180 billion freeze is structured as a sovereign asset preservation order under Canadian federal financial law, a mechanism that has existed in statute since 2009 but has never been invoked against a G7 partner. The $47 billion in near-term maturities will not roll. The remaining $133 billion will not move, will not be pledged as collateral, and will not be available for any operation requiring Bank of Canada cooperation. Second, Canada has simultaneously notified the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks in Basel, requesting an emergency review of U.S. Treasury market stability under the BIS's Sovereign Credit Monitoring Framework. The BIS has not received this kind of notification from a G7 member since the 2011 European sovereign debt crisis. The last time a notification of this type was filed, 3 rating agencies moved within the week. Third, and this is the element that made the Federal Reserve's internal communications go dark within minutes, Canada coordinated with the central banks of the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand to issue a joint statement announcing a review of Allied reserve currency exposure. The statement does not call for dollar replacement. It simply asks, in the formal language of central banking, whether Allied governments should reassess reserve holdings in an asset class that has become subject to political risk. When 4 Allied central banks ask that question publicly and simultaneously, currency traders do not wait for an answer. They begin pricing the question itself. Washington's calculation, across every confrontation with Canada over the preceding 18 months, had rested on a single foundational assumption. Canada needs American markets more than America needs Canadian cooperation. That assumption had never been tested against the dollar, because the dollar is not just an American asset. It is the architecture within which the entire global trading system operates. 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. The U.S. government finances its $1.8 trillion annual deficit by issuing debt that allied governments treat as the safest store of value on earth. That safety is not a physical property of American paper. It is a social contract, renewed every day in bond markets around the world, and Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, understands this with a precision that very few people in politics share. He knows exactly how much of the dollar's strength rests on Allied central bank participation, and exactly what happens when that participation becomes conditional. He did not freeze $180 billion because he expected to win a financial confrontation with the United States. He froze it because he knew what the act of freezing it would do to every other Allied central bank's internal risk models. 56 minutes after the Bank of Canada's order was filed, Carney appeared at a press conference in Ottawa. Alone at the podium, no ministers, no advisors visible. One sheet of paper he did not look at. He spoke for 9 minutes. His voice did not rise once. Canada holds $180 billion in U.S. Treasury securities because we have, for 80 years, treated American financial obligations as the most reliable store of national value available to a sovereign government. That trust was not automatic. It was earned. We are not selling those holdings. We are pausing. Because a pause is the appropriate response when the behavior that earned that trust is no longer the behavior we are observing. Then he laid out 4 countermeasures. Every one of them had been constructed to force Washington to confront not the bilateral relationship with Canada, but the global consequences of treating that relationship as disposable. The first countermeasure. The Bank of Canada is formally reclassifying its U.S. Treasury holdings from core reserve assets to review assets. This reclassification is immediately visible to every other central bank through the BIS reporting framework. Within hours, the reserve managers of 47 central banks will see that Canada has moved U.S. Treasuries out of its core holdings category for the first time in the instrument's modern history. They will not necessarily follow, but they will ask why. And in reserve management, when 47 institutions simultaneously ask why a G7 member reclassified U.S. debt, the question itself applies pressure that no American statement can fully neutralize. The second countermeasure. Canada is activating bilateral currency swap agreements with the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, allowing Canada to settle all trade obligations in euros and yen without touching its frozen treasury portfolio. The practical effect: Canada can continue all international trade activity normally for an indefinite period. The freeze is not self-harming. Canada built an exit architecture before it activated it, but this is where the response becomes something Washington had not prepared for. The third countermeasure. Canada is formally requesting, through the G7 finance ministers framework, an emergency session to discuss the stability implications of unilateral economic actions against treaty partners. Germany's finance minister confirmed within 19 minutes, France within 23, the United Kingdom within 31, Japan within 40. An emergency G7 finance ministers session has been called 4 times in the last 30 years. Each time it moved markets before it produced a single agreed statement. The fourth countermeasure was the one that stopped the room cold. Canada, in coordination with Norway, Australia, and Singapore, is publishing a joint paper through the BIS titled Reserve Currency Reliability in an Era of Unilateral Action. The paper does not advocate for dollar replacement. What it does is create, for the first time in the post-war period, a formal methodology through which allied governments can evaluate reserve currency exposure to political risk. Once a methodology exists, institutions are required by their own governance frameworks to apply it. Carney closed with one sentence, directed not at the White House, but at every finance ministry and central bank watching. The dollar's reserve status was built on the proposition that American obligations, financial, legal, and diplomatic, would be honored. Canada is not challenging that proposition. Canada is asking whether it is still true. He left without taking questions. The market reaction began before he finished speaking. Treasury yields moved in the first 90 seconds, 11 basis points on the 10-year before the first news alert finished distributing. 11 basis points is not a crash. In the Treasury market, 11 basis points on a single Allied announcement before European trading opens puts every institutional risk desk on the planet on active alert. The dollar weakened against the euro, the pound, and the yen within 4 minutes. Moving simultaneously across multiple currency pairs tells traders something specific. This is coordinated concern being priced at the same time. Japan did not participate in the morning's U.S. Treasury repurchase window. No statement, no explanation. Japan, the single largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury debt with $1.1 trillion in holdings, simply did not show up to one routine operation. It will almost certainly show up tomorrow. But for one morning, the largest foreign creditor the American government has was watching, quietly, from the sideline. And in the Treasury market, when Japan watches quietly, every other participant watches Japan. The heads of J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup were in a joint call with the National Economic Council before 8:30 a.m. What followed were simultaneous public statements from all three institutions at 9:04 a.m. requesting immediate executive engagement with Canadian financial authorities. 3 of the 4 largest banks in America were publicly asking the White House to call Ottawa. Before the opening bell, Washington has 3 paths. Each one was modeled by Carney's team before he walked to that podium. Escalate, and watch Allied central banks treat the escalation as confirmation that the reclassification was correct. The 47 institutions currently asking, "Why did Canada move U.S. Treasuries to review assets?" will get their answer. Markets will price the answer before Washington finishes the escalation memo. Stay silent and watch the 6-hour window close with no response visible to the institutional buyers making decisions about this afternoon's Treasury auction. Japanese pension funds, European sovereign wealth managers, Gulf state central banks. All of them will bid based on what they observe in that window. Silence is not neutral. It is a data point. De-escalate, which requires the kind of concrete, visible action that tells Allied central banks the reclassification was premature. Not a statement, not a spokesperson, a phone call, and Canada has made clear that the call has specific requirements attached to it that have nothing to do with the Treasury freeze itself. The dollar's reserve premium, the interest rate discount America receives on its debt because of the dollar's global status, is estimated at between 50 and 100 basis points annually. On $33 trillion in outstanding debt, that is up to $165 billion per year, the United States does not pay because Allied governments treat dollar assets as inherently reliable. If that reliability becomes even slightly conditional, the arithmetic of American deficit financing changes in ways no executive order can reverse. Mark Carney did not freeze $180 billion to win. He froze it to demonstrate that the option exists. In front of 47 central banks, 4 Allied finance ministries, and the entire infrastructure of global reserve management, all of whom are now running the same calculation he ran before he picked up the pen. Washington has 6 hours, and Carney is already back in his office. Canada did not build a reserve position in U.S. Treasuries to fund American political decisions. We built it because we trusted American institutions. The holdings are paused. The trust is under review. Both can be restored. The timeline is Washington's to determine.